Well, good evening. It's good to see all of you back to continue studying this fascinating series on the blessed hope. The title of our study for this evening is Protestants Are No More. Now, this title is not originally with me. Actually, it is an idea that came from an author called Alexander Vinay. He lived from 1797 to 1847. The only thing is, he expressed it this way: Protestants there are, but Protestantism is no more. I would like to say this evening that it's just the contrary. Protestantism is, but Protestants are no more. I'd like to refer, as we begin our study, to the words of the philosopher George Santayana, who said the following: "He who does not learn from the errors of history is doomed to repeat them." Now, this evening, we're going to study a lesson in history. We're going to notice how futurism infiltrated Protestantism. Now, most of the presentation will deal with history, and I hope you enjoy history. At the end, we're going to deal with some biblical issues. But most of the presentation has to do with historical events, because I think it's important for us to see how, in the course of history, these ideas penetrated from Roman Catholicism into Protestantism. Now, let's review very briefly what we studied in our last presentation. You remember the historical flow of Daniel chapter 7. You have a lion, which represents Babylon. You have a bear, which represents Medo-Persia. You have a leopard, which represents Greece. You have a dragon beast, which represents Rome. Then that dragon beast sprouts 10 horns, which represents the 10 divisions of the Roman Empire in the year 476. And then you have the little horn that comes up among the 10, which represents the Roman Catholic papacy, which ruled from 538 to 1798 AD. Now, Revelation 13 takes us one step further ahead, because Revelation 13 tells us that this little horn, who is called the beast in Revelation 13, is going to have a resurrection from a deadly wound. In other words, this little horn, this beast, ruled 1,260 years. At the end of the 1,260 years, received a deadly wound, and for a period, this power was inactive. But after a period of inactivity, this power will resurrect from its death wound and once again will rule the world. Now, we noticed in our study last evening that the Protestant reformers knew very well what this little Antichrist was, this little horn was. They had certain basic tenets. Number one, the Antichrist is not an individual. The Antichrist is a system. Secondly, the temple in which the Antichrist sits is not the literal Jerusalem temple. It represents the Christian church. Third, Israel is not literal Israel, but Israel represents God's true people, whether they be Jew or Gentile. And finally, the 3.5 years of dominion of the little horn were not literal years, but prophetic years. In other words, you had to apply the year-day principle to this period, which means that the little horn would govern not 3.5 literal years, but would govern 1,260 years. And as we noticed in our study last evening, because of the prophetic concepts of the reformers, the Roman Catholic Church not only lost individuals, but actually lost whole countries in Europe. As a result, the Roman Catholic Church said we have to do something to arrest this growing movement, the Protestant Reformation. And they soon realized that the only way to arrest the Protestant Reformation was by dealing with the prophetic concepts that were being taught by the Protestant reformers, that were pointing the finger clearly to the Roman Catholic papacy as a fulfillment of the Antichrist prophecies. We noticed in our study last night that St. Ignatius Loyola established the order of the Jesuits. The Council of Trent reaffirmed the beliefs of the Roman Catholic system. It became entrenched. We noticed that this order of the Jesuits produced two very able scholars who shifted and changed God's prophetic calendar. Luis de Alcázar, who established the system of preterism, the idea that the Antichrist prophecies were fulfilled in the distant past, and Francisco Rivera, who taught that the Antichrist had not arisen yet in his day, but would arise at the end of time, at the end of human history, 7 years before the glorious coming of Jesus. We also noticed that Bellarmine, also a Jesuit, carried the ideas of Francisco Rivera far and wide. For 300 years, as I mentioned as we closed our study last evening, the Protestant Reformation remained firm in its commitment that the papacy was the predicted Antichrist of prophecy. But in the early 1800s, actually in the late 1820s and early 1830s, the Protestant view began to show cracks. The Protestants began shifting their point of view concerning the Antichrist. The first individual that we know of who began shifting this view that the Antichrist of prophecy was the Roman Catholic papacy was a man called Samuel Maitland. In 1826, he wrote several pamphlets. The name of the pamphlets was Inquiries. In this series of pamphlets, Samuel Maitland said that the Antichrist prophecies did not point to the Roman Catholic papacy. He said that these prophecies needed to be understood as referring to a future blasphemous individual who would sit in the literal Jerusalem temple for a literal 3.5 years. For the first time that we know of, clergyman from the Church of England, which was a Protestant church, was teaching the same thing that Francisco Rivera and Bellarmine had taught several hundred years before. Many of the clergy of the Church of England started picking up these views, these divergent Protestant views. I'd like to read the concepts of two of these clergymen of the Church of England who lived early in the 1830s. The first of them is Robert Berg. He lived from 1800 to 1866. And he stated this: first, that the man of sin is not popery. By the way, the word popery means the papacy. First, that the man of sin is not popery appears from the necessity that this chapter, that is 2 Thessalonians 2, be understood of an individual and not of a power or office vested in numbers or held by succession. In other words, the Antichrist is an individual. It is not a succession of rulers or individuals in a system. He also said this: I would say that an individual is intended, one person whose pretensions live and die with himself. Furthermore, he continued saying, secondly, the nature of these same acts, that is the acts of this man of sin of 2 Thessalonians 2, secondly, the nature of these same acts and pretensions prove that the man of sin is not the Pope. Categorically, In the early 1830s, we find this clergyman, Robert Berg, as well as other clergymen, clearly stating that the papacy was not the Antichrist, that the Antichrist would be a literal individual who would sit in a literally rebuilt Jewish temple and would rule for a literal 3.5 years. Another individual from the Church of England, also a clergyman, who began teaching these views was James Todd. James Todd lived from 1805 to 1869. In 1838, he presented a series of lectures which he later published. The name of the lectures was this: Discourses on the Prophecies Relating to Antichrist in the Writings of Daniel and St. Paul. What views did James Todd express in those lectures? Basically, he said, first of all, that Antichrist would be an individual, not a system. This individual would appear shortly before the second coming of Jesus. Secondly, Antichrist would not sit in the Christian church. The Antichrist would sit in the literally rebuilt Jewish temple. Number three, Antichrist would not rule for 1,260 years, but was to rule for 1,260 literal days, which is 3.5 literal years. Number four, the fourth kingdom of Daniel 7 was not the Roman Empire, according to James Todd. Now, amazingly, you would say, okay, well, he believed this futurist view of the Roman Catholic Church, but he went one step further. He actually started teaching that the Roman Catholic Church was a true Christian church. In fact, allow me to read you 3 statements from the writings of James Todd where he addresses the issue of the identity of the Roman Catholic Church. They're very short statements. First of all, he said this: Romanism, that's another way of speaking about the papacy, Romanism is not properly an apostasy from the faith. In a second statement, he says this: the errors of Romanism do not amount to apostasy. And finally, the most amazing statement, he says, the Church of Rome is a true Christian church. Isn't it amazing that the minute that these Protestant clergymen shift their views concerning the Antichrist, immediately they see the Roman Catholic Church in a different light, as a true church, not as a church who has apostatized from the faith, but a genuine Christian church. You see, the point is that when the church goes astray from its prophetic foundations, from its prophetic roots, the end result is that they want to join the very system that they recognize as being Christian rather than apostate. The story continues. Between 1833 and 1845, mark that date, very important date, 1833 to 1845, in England was established what is known as the Oxford Tractarian movement. Actually, 90 tracts for the times, as they were called, were written during this period. This movement was spearheaded by an individual which probably most of you have heard of, John Henry Cardinal Newman. Anybody ever heard of John Henry Cardinal Newman? Yes, many of you have heard about him. Do you know the history of Cardinal Newman? He actually wrote 29 of the 90 tracts for the times. He said in these tracts that the Protestant Reformation was a tragic mistake. He also advocated a return of the Protestant Church of England to the communion of the Mother Church, the Roman Catholic Church. In fact, he renounced his credentials in the Church of England, and he became a convert to the Roman Catholic Church, where he was accepted as a member in 1845. In fact, in 1879, John Henry Cardinal Newman was given the hat of a cardinal. He became a cardinal in the Roman Catholic Church. Now we must move way south of Europe. And we're going to digress for a moment, but this is very closely related to what we're dealing with in England in the 1830s. We must go down to the country of Chile. There lived an individual from 1731 to 1801 whom I'm sure you have heard about as well. His name is Emanuel de Lacunza y Diaz. We know him as Lacunza. How many of you have ever heard of Lacunza? If you've read the book Great Controversy, you've heard of Lacunza. Did you know that Lacunza was a member of the Jesuit order? Did you know that many of the prophetic views that Lacunza had were views that were almost identical to the views of Francisco Rivera? In fact, Lacunza wrote a masterpiece, a theological masterpiece, whose title was La venida del Mesías en gloria y majestad, which translated means the coming of the Messiah in glory and majesty. Now you're saying, why are you going all the way down to Chile? The simple reason is that a copy of Lacunza's book found its way all the way from Chile to England in the decade of the 1830s. And in a moment, I'm going to tell you what happened with that book. But before I do, allow me to share with you certain of the ideas, of the prophetic ideas of Lacunza. First of all, he taught that Revelation 4 through 22 deals exclusively with future events. Number two, the 3.5 times of the little horn's dominion are literal years. Number three, during the millennium, Christ will reign personally on planet Earth. Number four, the 144,000 are literal Jews. Number five, the literal Jerusalem temple would be rebuilt. Then he said that literal animal sacrifices would once again be offered there in the temple in Jerusalem. He taught that during the millennium, the literal Jews would be regathered and converted. And he also taught that God would fulfill his literal covenant with the literal Jewish nation. Now, Lacunza diverged from the regular Jesuits like Francisco Rivera on a couple of points. First of all, we find that Lacunza was what you call a premillennialist. He believed that Jesus Christ was going to come before the beginning of the millennium. You say, well, that's what we believe. But in the time in which Lacunza wrote, the Roman Catholic Church taught a view which is known as amillennialism, the idea that during that time they were already in the millennium, and that the purpose of God was that the church, by using the political systems of the world, should establish Christ's kingdom on planet Earth. And so the Roman Catholic Church did not speak much about the second coming of Christ because they believed that Christ's kingdom would be established by the church taking over the world. So Lacunza diverged from that in teaching, no, the millennium is not now. The millennium will be after the glorious second coming of Jesus Christ. He also taught that even though the Antichrist will be in the future and will rule for a literal 3.5 years, he says that the Antichrist was not going to be one individual, but was going to be an apostate system. So he diverged somewhat from Francisco Rivera, but most of his points of view were the regular futurism that had been taught by the Roman Catholic Counter-Reformation. Now you say, why do you bring Lacunza into this? What does he have to do with England in the 1830s? Well, allow me now to go back to England and speak to you about a series of groups that were established in the Church of England known as the Plymouth Brethren. Have you ever heard of the Plymouth Brethren? Some of you probably have. Actually, these study and prayer groups were established all over Great Britain. They were established in Scotland, in Ireland, and in England around the year 1825. You see, at this time, the Church of England was dry, formalistic, and stagnant. And so these men, through the study of Bible prophecy, wanted to bring a revival and a reformation within the Church of England. Now, to the Plymouth Brethren belonged two notable individuals that we need to keep in mind. One of them was called Edward Irving, and the second one was called John Nelson Darby. Now you say, that's Greek to me, Pastor. I've never heard of Edward Irving. I've never heard of John Nelson Darby. Well, that's why we're talking about them this evening, because they have a lot to do with how these ideas penetrated from Catholicism into Protestantism. It just so happens that Edward Irving came across a copy of the book that had come from Chile that was written by Emmanuel Lacunza. And he was so fascinated by this book, Edward Irving was, that he actually translated it into English. And he started sharing the views that he got from Lacunza far and wide in this decade of the 1830s in England. In other words, futurism not only came from Francisco Rivera in Spain, but it was also coming from this work of Lacunza all the way from South America. Both sources were Jesuit sources. They were members of the Roman Catholic counterfeit Reformation. You see, there was a big problem at this time with the theology that was being propounded by these Protestants who were adopting the Roman Catholic view. You see, they taught that Revelation chapter 4 through 19 applied to the Jews in the future. But people would ask them, if you say that Revelation 4 through 19 applies to the Jews in the future, where is the church? Why isn't the church mentioned in Revelation 4 through 19? They needed a way to explain why the church, in their mind, was absent from Revelation 4 all the way to Revelation chapter 19. They needed a way to explain the absence of the church. And of course, the answer came, but it came in a very, very strange way. It just so happens that in the church, which was pastored by Edward Irving, a very interesting experience took place, and I want to read the account as it is given by Samuel P. Tregel. He was present there when this event took place. Notice what he says. I am not aware that there was any definite teaching that there would be a secret rapture of the church at a secret coming until this was given forth as an utterance in Mr. Irving's church. When he says an utterance, it means that somebody in the congregation spoke this in an unknown tongue, in ecstasis. Once again, I am not aware that there was any definite teaching that there would be a secret rapture of the church at a secret coming until this was given forth as an utterance in Mr. Irving's church, from what was there received as being the voice of the Spirit. But whether anyone ever asserted such a thing or not, it was from that supposed revelation that the modern doctrine and modern phraseology arose. In other words, the phraseology of the secret rapture. It came not from Holy Scripture, but from that which falsely pretended to be the Spirit of God. In other words, the idea of a pre-tribulation rapture of the church came not from the study of Scripture, but it came from an ecstatic utterance in an unknown tongue in the church that was pastored by Edward Irving. Do you know, it's no coincidence that Hal Lindsey, who has really received the mantle or the cloak of John Nelson Darby and Edward Irving, do you know that Hal Lindsey had the same type of experience, according to him, when he was writing his most recent book, Vanished into Thin Air? Allow me to read his own words in the book, Vanished into Thin Air, page 51. He says this as he was writing his book. There were times that I experienced the presence of the Holy Spirit in such power that I went into an ecstatic state. It's no secret that back in the times of Edward Irving, people were involved in the tongues movement. People were involved in spiritualism. People were going through supernatural phenomena. And this phenomena that took place in the church of Edward Irving was not the exception, it was the rule. And of course now they had a way of explaining why the church was not in Revelation 4 through 19. Because according to Darby and according to Irving, because of this ecstatic utterance that said that there was going to be a secret rapture of the church before the tribulation, now they could explain why the church was absent from Revelation 4 through 19. It was because in Revelation 4 verse 1, the church is raptured to heaven, and everything from there on applies to the literal Jews. Now allow me to say a few words about John Nelson Darby. I'd like to give you a physical description of Darby as given by Cardinal Newman's brother. He knew him personally and admired him. He says this: evidently he wasn't a very attractive person. He says he was a most remarkable man who rapidly gained an immense sway over me. His bodily presence was indeed weak. A fallen cheek, a bloodshot eye, crippled limbs resting on crutches, a seldom shaven beard, a shabby suit of clothes, and a generally neglected person drew at first pity with wonder to see such a figure in a drawing room. So is John Nelson Darby. But his physical appearance has nothing to do with the ability, the scholarly ability that this man had to proliferate the ideas of futurism. John Nelson Darby actually had very little respect for history. In fact, let me read you a statement by Darby where he says this: I do not admit history to be in any sense necessary to the understanding of prophecy. He says we don't need history to understand prophecy. Why would he say such a thing? Well, it's very simple. If you believe that you have Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome, and then history stops, in other words, the prophecy does not continue fulfilling, you have a gap of 2,000 years plus, and then prophecy starts fulfilling again, you don't need the reference of the past to understand the future. Are you understanding what I'm saying? So he says you don't need history. Historicism thrives on history. History is indispensable. But in futurism, history has no importance. And so Darby says, I do not admit history to be in any sense necessary to the understanding of prophecy. In fact, Darby radically dichotomized or divided, made a radical separation between Israel and the church. He said this, and I'm actually quoting Hal Lindsey about Darby's views. I believe that God's purpose for Israel and his purpose for the church are so distinct and mutually exclusive that they cannot both be in force on earth at the same time, especially during the 7-year tribulation. If this is so, then the church must be removed before God can deal specifically again with Israel as defined in Daniel's prophecy of the 70 weeks. In other words, he says God has one plan for Israel and he has another plan for the church. The plan for the church is to take them to heaven in the rapture, and then all of the prophecies of Revelation, starting with chapter 4, the prophecy of the little horn in Daniel chapter 7 and chapter 8 will be fulfilled on earth with the literal Jews during a 7-year tribulation. That can be traced directly back to Darby. God has mutually exclusive plans for Israel and for the church. Now you say, okay, all of this was happening in England among the Plymouth Brethren. The book by Lacunza came and it persuaded Irving. You have this ecstatic utterance where the secret rapture doctrine is taught in an unknown tongue in his congregation. What does all that have to do with what happened in the United States? Well, it just so happens that John Nelson Darby traveled, we know for a fact, at least 6 times to the United States from England between 1859 and 1874. We also know that John Nelson Darby, who is known as the father of dispensationalism, dispensationalism is another synonymous term for futurism. It's also known that he wrote several books Now, in the United States, there was a man called Cyrus Ingerson Schofield. Anybody ever heard of Schofield, the Schofield Reference Bible? Several of you have. He was converted to Christianity in the year 1879. He became senior pastor of a large congregational church in Dallas. And one day, as he was going through the library, one of the libraries in Dallas, he discovered a book written by John Nelson Darby that had found its way from England all the way to Dallas. He was so impacted by the content of this book, the futuristic perspective of Bible prophecy, that he decided that he would write a book about it himself. And in 1888, he wrote the book, Rightly Dividing the Word of Truth, which is still published today and is used as a textbook about how to study Bible prophecy. He also began a monthly publication called The Believer. And through these two mediums, through his book, Rightly Dividing the Word of Truth, and through the journal, The Believer, his ideas started spreading. His ideas, of course, were the ideas that he had gotten from Darby. In fact, we know that Schofield taught at Dwight Moody's School in Chicago. And we also know that all across the United States, he led out in Bible conferences on Bible prophecy. You see, futurism had now been transposed from England to the United States. Now, allow me to say something about the Schofield Reference Bible. Schofield's, I'm going to read a statement now from Richard Kyle. By the way, Richard Kyle used to be a member of the Plymouth Brethren. He used to be a futurist. This is what he says. Schofield's enduring legacy rests in his reference Bible, published in 1909, expanded in 1917, and revised in 1967. Sales of this Bible total about 10 million. The Schofield Bible immediately became the standard of dispensationalism. That's the idea that God divides history into 7 dispensations. The last one is the period of the tribulation, the 7-year period. He continues saying, the Schofield Bible immediately became the standard of dispensationalism, and for 90 years has been the major vehicle for distributing dispensational ideas. Let me just share with you a small story that illustrates how much power the Schofield Reference Bible has in the minds of people. Several years ago, I taught a Revelation seminar in the city of Mount Holly, New Jersey. And on opening night, I noticed this real nice-looking young couple come to the table. Of course, we gave everyone a Bible. When they came to the table, they said, we don't want a Bible, we have our own Bible. And of course, I took a peek, and I saw that they had the Schofield Reference Bible. By the way, the Schofield Reference Bible is the King James translation. But what makes it unique is that at the bottom of the page, you have all types of explanatory notes, which express the views of dispensationalism and futurism concerning Bible prophecy. And so this couple came in, they sat down. I knew now that they had the Schofield Reference Bible. I knew where they were coming from. And I started teaching the seminar. And I finally got to the lesson on Revelation 4 and 5, the introduction to the 7 seals. And of course, they believed that that applied to the period after the church is raptured to heaven. Revelation 4 verse 1 is the rapture according to them. And so I taught the historicist view of Revelation 4 and 5. And all through my presentation, I could see this young man going like this. His head was down. He's saying, no, no, no. They quit coming. So I called them. And I said, you know, we've been missing you at the seminar. He said, well, we decided that we're not going to attend the seminar anymore. I said, oh, how come? He says, well, because in the last lesson that you taught on Revelation chapter 4 and 5, that doesn't square with our Bible. And so I acted kind of ignorant. I said, what Bible is that? He says, with the Schofield Reference Bible. I said, oh, really? Did you know that the notes in the Schofield Reference Bible are not part of the Bible? He says, yeah, I realize that they're not part of the Bible, but they're part of my belief system. And they never came back to the seminar. That shows the power that the Scofield Reference Bible has in the minds of futurists. In fact, all of these individuals who are into futurism, into this idea of a 7-year tribulation, when the church is gone, is raptured, all of those who believe in this scenario take as their basic textbook the Scofield Reference Bible. I'm going to read a statement from George Eldon Ladd. He used to be a futurist. He used to be a dispensationalist. He's not a Seventh-day Adventist. Notice what he says. It would probably come as a shock to many modern futurists to be told that the first scholar in relatively modern times who returned to the patristic futuristic interpretation was a Spanish Jesuit named Ribera. He says, in 1590, Ribera published a commentary on the Revelation as a counter-interpretation to the prevailing view among Protestants, which identified the papacy with the Antichrist. Here's a non-Seventh-day Adventist scholar who's saying that the purpose of Ribera was to counteract the Protestant Reformation. He continues saying, Ribera applied all of Revelation, but the earliest chapters, to the end time rather than to the history of the church. Antichrist would be a single evil person who would be received by the Jews and would rebuild Jerusalem, abolish Christianity, deny Christ, persecute the church, and rule the world for 3.5 years. Here is an individual who used to be a futurist saying that the purpose of Ribera was to counteract the Protestant Reformation. Allow me to read a couple of other statements. This next one is also from a Protestant. He's not a Seventh-day Adventist. Dean Henry Alford. He says, speaking about futurism, the founder of this system in modern times appears to have been the Jesuit Ribera about AD 1580. Even the Roman Catholic scholar G.S. Hitchcock says this: the futurist school, founded by the Jesuit Ribera in 1591, looks for Antichrist, Babylon, and a rebuilt temple in Jerusalem at the end of the Christian dispensation. And then he says about the preterist school, founded by the Jesuit Alcázar in 1614, explains the revelation by the fall of Jerusalem or by the fall of pagan Rome in 410 AD. Here you have a Roman Catholic scholar saying that the futurist school comes from Ribera and the preterist school comes from Luis de Alcázar. Not a Protestant, but a Roman Catholic. Allow me to read once again from Richard Kyle, who was once a member of the Plymouth Brethren. He believed this futurist scenario. He also recognizes that these schools came from Roman Catholicism into Protestantism. He says this: among the Jesuits who insisted that the Antichrist was still to come, the approach of the Spaniard Francisco Ribera had significant implications for future millennial thought. Both Catholics and Protestants who identified the Antichrist as a contemporary pope or leader generally took a historicist interpretation of John's revelation. Did you notice how Protestants did this? They what? Once again, he says, they generally took a historicist interpretation of John's revelation. He says this: Ribera reintroduced a somewhat literal futuristic view of the apocalypse of John. In doing so, he concluded that the Antichrist was a future renegade Jew. So the scholars measure in. Non-Adventist scholars, you might be saying, oh, this is Pastor Bohr's scenario, that this is the way that these views came into Protestantism. I've read to you from George Eldon Ladd. I've read to you from Dean Alford. I've read to you from Roman Catholic scholar G.S. Hitchcock, from Richard Kyle, who used to belong to the Plymouth Brethren. There are others that I could read that say that these schools came directly from Roman Catholicism, and it has penetrated into Protestantism from that source. Now, those of you who have belonged to perhaps the Pentecostal movement or the evangelical movement, to conservative Protestantism, know that these ideas have grown like a grass fire. And there are 5 factors that have led to the growth in Protestantism of these views. Number 1, as I mentioned, the Scofield Reference Bible. Number 2, the vast proliferation of television evangelists. Is that true? You turn on the television any Sunday morning, and you'll find them preaching about the rapture, the rebuilding of the temple, the Antichrist sitting in the temple, the Antichrist demanding worship, a single individual dominating the world for 3.5 years, persecuting the Jews. All of this comes from Rivera, Bellarmine, Lacunza, and other Jesuit theologians that have infiltrated these ideas into conservative Protestantism. A third factor in the growth of these ideas is fiction and non-fiction books like the Left Behind series. Another factor is the production of thriller movies, such as Left Behind, The Omega Code, Armageddon. And a fifth factor is the work that is done at Dallas Theological Seminary, at Moody Bible Institute in Chicago. They're forming whole generations of pastors that believe and preach this futurist scenario. Did you know, for example, that the 12-volume series, the Left Behind series, has sold over 62 million copies? For months, this 12-volume series has been on the New York Times bestseller list. And do you know what the purpose of these books is with this futurist scenario? Let's allow Jerry Jenkins, who is one of the co-authors of these books, to tell us. He says this: the purpose was to encourage the church and to persuade unbelievers. See, they're trying to gain converts to this futuristic view. He continues saying, we have found that people are reading the Bible again because of it. That is, because of this series. And many have become believers. Believers in what, is my question? Believers in a futuristic scenario, which is a counterfeit interpretation of prophecy imported directly from Roman Catholicism? Tim LaHaye, one of the co-authors, says this about the series: I'm hearing from church pastors all over the world, and they're telling me that the books are the best evangelistic tools they've ever seen. It's gratifying to see so much interest in this story. Because of any of the major world religions, Christianity has the most exciting story to tell about the future. Folks, you go to a Christian bookstore, you cannot find a book with a historicist mode of interpretation. You hardly ever will even find a book that has the preterist point of view. I mean, the names of the writers is legion. Hal Lindsey, Tim LaHaye, Jerry Jenkins, Grant Jeffrey, John Valvoord, John Hagee, Benny Hinn, Jack Van Impe, Jack Lalonde, Dave Hunt, David Jeremiah, Zola Levitt, Arno Fries, Pat Robertson, Randall Price, Dwight Pentecost, Jerry Falwell, Billy Graham, ad infinitum, have all assimilated these views from Roman Catholicism. The concepts that some of these futurists have borders on the absurd and the ridiculous. Take, for example, Grant Jeffries. Any of you ever heard of Grant Jeffries? He wrote a book called The Signature of God, The Handwriting of God. He claims to have cracked the secret code of biblical prophecy by employing the Hebrew numbering system. Now you say, what's that? Well, he attributes to each letter of the Hebrew Old Testament a number. And he says that by this secret numbering system, he's able to discover many of the things that have been happening in the world today. Like, for example, what? He says the death of Princess Di, the plague of AIDS, the assassination of Franz Joseph I of Austria, the peace process of Israel and the PLO, the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, the Gulf War. He even claims to have found in the prophecies of the Old Testament the specific names America, George Bush, General Schwarzkopf, Scud B missile, and Russia. He also claims to have found predictions of the Oklahoma City bombing. with the specific names Timothy McVeigh and Oklahoma. In fact, he claims to have found some cryptic message by using this numbering system that says day 19, 9th hour, which is the very time in which the Oklahoma City building exploded. Folks, apart from the fact that the Bible is not concerned with trivialities such as this, I find it amazing that Jeffrey thinks he is able to find all of these hidden, cryptic, secret, veiled, subliminal messages, and at the same time has not been able to figure out something as clear and simple as which is the right day of the week to go to church. Is it clear in the Bible? Of course. So why look for what's not clear? Let's stick to the clear. Let's examine one of these futurist writers, and I'll tell you I have a burden for this man, because this man is not your run-of-the-mill futurist. He has some things right, and I believe he's sincere. His name is Dave Hunt. He's written 2 scathing books. One of them is called A Woman Rides the Beast, and the other is called Global Peace. In these books, he gives a scathing criticism of the Roman Catholic Church. You think I've been strong here? This has been tame, considering, compared to what this man has written. By the way, he's an evangelical. He is not obviously a Seventh-day Adventist. He teaches that the harlot of Revelation chapter 17 is the Roman Catholic papacy. And he lays into the papacy in these 2 books, hundreds and hundreds of pages, delving into the history of the Roman Catholic Church. When he's asked, who is Babylon in the end time? I want you to notice. By the way, do you know that futurists say that you're supposed to take all of Revelation literally? Literally. So when Revelation says Babylon, you go to Iraq. When Revelation says Jerusalem, yeah, it means Jerusalem over there. Nothing symbolic. Everything is literal. However, when he talks about Babylon, notice how he goes against his own principle. He says, some suggest that the Vatican will move to Babylon in Iraq when it is rebuilt. But why should it? The Vatican has been fulfilling John's vision from its location in Rome for the past 15 centuries. So he's saying Babylon isn't in Babylon, Babylon is Rome. He's spiritualizing the meaning of Babylon, which is anathema for futurists, because they say everything is to be taken literally. He continues saying, moreover, we have shown the connection to ancient Babylon, which the Vatican has maintained down through the history in the paganized Christianity it has promulgated. As for ancient Babylon itself, it wasn't even in existence during the past 2,300 years to reign over the kings of the earth. Babylon lay in ruins, while pagan Rome and later Catholic Rome, the new Babylon, was indeed reigning over kings. What does he say? That the Roman Catholic Church is the new Babylon. But wait a minute, if we're supposed to take things literally, how can you say that we're not dealing with a literal city over in Iraq? If Babylon is a spiritual worldwide system, then Jerusalem, the enemy of Babylon, must also be a worldwide spiritual system. Amen. Are you understanding what I'm saying? In fact, he continues saying in the book Global Peace, pages 72 and 73, God is foretelling his final judgment upon a great evil which began at the Tower of Babel, and which has only grown as politics, religion, and science have become more sophisticated, until finally, notice, the whole world is united in the pursuit of Satan's ancient lie. This is the Babylon, revived and headquartered in Rome, that will be destroyed, never to be inhabited again. At least Dave Hunt finds that Roman Catholicism is going to play a tremendous role in Bible prophecy. Now, when Dave Hunt talks about the 4 powers of Daniel chapter 7, you would say, this guy's a historicist. Allow me to read you a statement about the 4 empires of the book of Daniel as is found in the writings of Dave Hunt. He says this, Daniel explained that Nebuchadnezzar, represented by the head of gold, was the ruler of the first world empire. Are we agreed on that? Yes. The 3 other parts of the image, made of silver, brass, and iron, foreshadowed 3 more world empires that would follow Babylon as its successors. In a later vision, Daniel would be given the name of the second world empire, Medo-Persia, and details concerning the third kingdom, which clearly identified it as the Grecian Empire. The fourth world empire, of course, would be Rome. That much is history. Does he sound like a historicist? Yeah. Oh, yes, he says Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. You say, good for Dave Hunt. But don't start clapping yet. Before I tell you what he says about the 10 horns and the little horn, allow me to read a statement where he describes what the Antichrist is going to be like. He says, while the Greek prefix anti generally means against or opposed to, it can also mean in the place of or a substitute for. The Antichrist will embody both meanings. He will oppose Christ while pretending to be Christ. Instead of a frontal assault against Christianity, the evil one will pervert the church from within by posing as its founder. He will cunningly misrepresent Christ while pretending to be Christ. And right here is where the plot thickens. If the Antichrist will indeed pretend to be Christ, then his followers must be Christians. And you say, wow, this is amazing. Is that a perfect description of the Roman Catholic system? It is, but Dave Hunt doesn't see it. Notice what he says. Obviously, what the toes represent has not yet come to pass. Where does he stop? At the legs. When you get to the bottom of the legs, to the feet, psst, prophecy stops. He says, obviously, what the toes represent has not yet come to pass. God's kingdom was not established in the days of these 10 kings. Furthermore, now notice this, furthermore, the Antichrist never appeared to take the reins of the ancient Roman Empire. That's unbelievable. Because Roman Catholicism did, according to all historians, take the place of the old Roman Empire. How he can't see it is beyond me. And then he even goes one step further. He says the Protestant reformers were wrong in identifying the papacy as the Antichrist. Allow me to read the statement. He says, the reformers and their creeds, this is a Protestant writing, the reformers and their creeds were unanimous in identifying each pope as the Antichrist. Scripture, however, does not support that claim. The Antichrist is a unique individual without predecessors or successors. Amazing, amazing blindness. What is Hunt's bottom line? In spite of the fact that he sees that the papacy is the harlot of Revelation 17, he sees a role of Roman Catholicism in the dominion of the world at the end of time, he still believes that the Antichrist is an individual. He will sit in the literal Jewish temple. He will reign for a literal 3.5 years. The church will be removed in the rapture. Revelation 4 through 19 applies to the future. The millennium will be a period of literal time on planet Earth. There's a gap between week number 69 and week number 70 in the 70 weeks, and there's a gap of 2,000 years between the legs and the toes, between the fourth beast and the 10 horns and the little horn. And right there, in that gap that he has established, is hiding the real Antichrist. And he can't see him. Actually, preterism and futurism have hijacked Protestantism. Preterism has hijacked liberal Protestants. And futurism has hijacked conservative Protestants. And both of these systems can be proven historically came from the Roman Catholic Church into Protestantism. In fact, they're not so different. Futurism says that the future Antichrist will be a literal person who will sit in a literal Jewish temple for a literal 3.5 years. Preterism says that the Antichrist was a literal person who sat in the literal Jewish temple for a literal 3.5 years. The only difference is that futurism sees the Antichrist in the future, whereas preterism sees the Antichrist in the past. But both of them literalize, and both of the systems detract people's eyes from seeing the true fulfillment of the Antichrist prophecies. Now, If you read Protestant works today, you would think that you were reading Ribera and Bellarmine and Newman and Lacunza, instead of reading Luther and Calvin and Zwingli and all of the reformers, who many of them spilt their blood to uphold the Protestant message. Now I need to go to one final point. Why in the 1830s, in England, of all places? Why would that be the place where these ideas would penetrate into Protestantism from Catholicism? Well, the fact is, folks, that in the 1830s, on the other side of the Atlantic, there was a great revival taking place, known as the Great Second Advent Movement, spearheaded by a man called William Miller, who was using historicism as his method of studying the prophecies. Now, many of you know that William Miller taught that Jesus Christ was going to come October 22, 1844. And Jesus obviously didn't come October 22, 1844. But later on it was discovered that something did happen October 22, 1844. How did William Miller reach this date? It was by following the sequence, the historical sequence of powers, and applying the year-day principle to the 2300 days. Is that not true? Absolutely. But when Jesus didn't come, Protestants gave up on historicism. Not only did an attack against historicism come from Europe, in England, it also came as a result of the disappointment. Protestants said what he said was going to be fulfilled didn't take place. His method is wrong. And so they threw out the proverbial baby with the bathwater. Do you think the devil knew that there was going to be a great Second Advent movement in 1844? Does the devil study Bible prophecy? Do you think he knew the meaning of Daniel 8:14, unto 2300 days the sanctuary shall be cleansed? Do you think he understood Revelation 10, where it spoke about these people who would proclaim the message of Daniel? It would be sweet in the mouth but bitter in the stomach. Of course the devil knew. He's a student of Bible prophecy, so he says, I've got to counteract that historicist method of interpreting prophecy. So he begins it in England, and then after the disappointment, he leads Protestants to abandon historicism. And in case you think that I'm just speculating on this, allow me to read from the scholars. Once again, Richard Kyle, who has written a book, The Last Days Are Here Again. He was a member of the Plymouth Brethren. He says this: despite its visibility, the Millerite movement had little influence on subsequent end-time thinking. It did, however, have three long-term effects. Millerism had three long-term effects. Number one, Millerism spawned the Seventh-day Adventist Church. This is a non-Adventist writing. Number two, it discredited historicist premillennialism, causing it to fade out almost entirely after 1844. And number three, the Millerite fiasco demonstrated the perils of setting definite dates for Christ's return. He further says this: the great disappointment of 1844 had decimated historicist premillennialism. But a futurist premillennialism called dispensationalism soon arrived on the scene. I'd like to read also from Thomas Ice, a futurist. He wrote in the book, The Great Tribulation, Past or Future, page 6, this: historicism, notice this, historicism, once the dominant view of Protestants from the Reformation until the middle of the last century. This is a futurist admitting that this was the Protestant view until the middle of the last century. Of course, he's writing in 1999, so the last century would be the 1800s, the middle of the 1800s. He says, historicism, once the dominant view of Protestants from the Reformation until the middle of the last century, appears to exert little attraction as a system of prophetic interpretation to conservative Christians. And then he puts in parentheses, outside of Seventh-day Adventist circles. Thus has no influence outside Seventh-day Adventist circles. He says, within, now notice this, within evangelicalism, That is, conservative Protestants. During the last 150 years, futurism has grown to dominate and overcome historicism. A futurist writing, who is not an Adventist, who believes that historicism was slain by futurism, and that the only place it survives is in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. He says it himself. Revelation chapter 16, verse 13 speaks about a false prophet. He's the false prophet of the beast. He speaks for the beast. This system is also called the image to the beast. It's the second beast of Revelation chapter 13, which represents Protestantism in the United States. Now let me ask you, do Protestants keep the same day which was changed by the Roman Catholic papacy? Yes. Yes? Yes. Do they accept the change in the law? Yes. Do Protestants today, conservative Protestants, employ the same prophetic methodology as was used by the Catholic counter-reformers? Yes. Are they an image? Both in the day they keep and in the prophetic methods that they use, have they changed the times? According to Scripture and history, yes. You see, folks, if Protestantism had not gone astray from its roots, Billy Graham would not call the Pope the greatest moral leader of the world. If Protestants had not gone astray from their prophetic roots, Robert Schuller would not say that he hopes the day will come when the whole Christian world will accept the Pope as its leader. Paul Crouch would not say that he's not protesting anything and that he's deleting the word Protestant from his vocabulary. Lutherans would never have signed a joint declaration on righteousness by faith, and Pat Robertson would not have signed the document Evangelicals and Catholics together. Because if they identified the true Antichrist, would they really want to join with the Antichrist? Of course not. You see, this is the point. When you abandon your prophetic roots that identifies the Roman Catholic papacy as the Antichrist, the end result is that you want to join with them because you see no danger in it. Are you understanding what I'm saying? This is a matter of life and death. Now allow me to go to one final point. This has been a long lecture, 10 whole pages worth. At least on my pages. But you have all of the quotations and everything on PowerPoint with the references, the books. I haven't read where they came from, the page number and everything. But see, that's an incentive for you to get the DVDs. Daniel 7:25. I'll finish with this point. Daniel 7 verse 25 says that the little horn would think to change times and the law. Times refers to the prophetic calendar, and the law represents the Ten Commandments. Would it do this during the 1260 years? During the times and the dividing of time? That's what Daniel 7 says. Let me ask you, at the end of this period, was God going to raise up a people who were going to correct these two problems? Last text, Revelation chapter 12. Revelation chapter 12 and verse 17. And by the way, I don't have time to show you this, but Revelation 12:17 comes immediately after the 1260 years. That's how we can connect Daniel 7:25 and Revelation 12:17. Because in Daniel 7:25 you have times the dividing of time. Immediately before Revelation 12:17 you have times the dividing of time. In Daniel it says that the little horn thinks he can change the times and the law. But in Revelation it says, 12:17, it says that God will raise up a people who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus, which is the true gift of prophecy. Enter the book Great Controversy as the true interpretation of prophecy. God gave it shortly after 1798 to correct the false prophetic views that he knew were going to enter into Protestantism. Isn't this an amazing story that we've studied this evening? How these ideas have crept into and taken over Protestantism. God needs a people in this world that will hold high the standard of prophetic truth given to our fathers, the Protestant reformers. May we be those people, is my prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you for the study we've been able to have this evening. We ask, Lord, that you will be with us now as we conclude this service. We're just saddened by what we've studied. But we ask that you will give us the strength and the courage to stand for truth, though the heavens fall. We thank you, Lord, for hearing our prayer, for we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.